On September 17, 1859, a man walked into the offices of the San Francisco Bulletin and handed the editor a proclamation. It was written on official-looking paper, stamped with a seal, and signed with elaborate flourishes. The proclamation declared that the United States Congress was dissolved, that the government was corrupt and ineffective, and that a new ruler had assumed power. The man's name was Joshua Norton. He had just declared himself Norton Os, Emperor of the United States. The editor could have laughed him out of the office. He could have ignored him. Instead, he published the proclamation in the next day's paper. And San Francisco, rather than mocking Norton or having him arrested, decided to play along. For the next 21 years, Joshua Norton ruled over nothing and everything. He had no army, no palace, no treasury. He wore a tattered military uniform decorated with homemade epaulettes. He walked the streets of San Francisco issuing decrees, attending civic events, and dining in restaurants that fed him for free. Newspapers printed his proclamations. The city's elite invited him to theater openings. When his uniform wore out, the city council voted to provide him with a new one. He issued currency that local businesses honored. He abolished the Democratic and Republican parties. He ordered the construction of a bridge connecting San Francisco to Oakland, decades before it was actually built. And when he died in 1880, over 10,000 people attended his funeral. Emperor Norton was not a ruler. He was a homeless man who had lost everything in a business failure and whose mind had broken under the strain. But San Francisco chose to treat him with dignity, kindness, and a peculiar form of respect. In this video, we shall dive deep in one of the most unusual and heartwarming stories in American history, and explore how a city embraced a man who declared himself emperor. This is the story of Emperor Norton. Joshua Abraham Norton was born in England around 1818, though some records suggest 1819. His family emigrated to South Africa when he was young, and Norton spent his early years in Cape Town, where his father was a successful merchant. Norton received a decent education and learned the family business. But when his parents died in the 1840s, Norton inherited a modest fortune and decided to seek his fortune elsewhere. In 1849, Norton arrived in San Francisco, drawn by the California gold rush. But Norton was not a miner. He was a businessman. He invested in real estate and commodities, and for a time he was successful. By the early 1850s, Norton was relatively wealthy, respected in San Francisco's small but growing business community. He lived comfortably, dressed well, and was known as a shrewd but honest trader. Then came the rice scheme. In 1852, a famine in China created a shortage of rice in San Francisco, where the Chinese immigrant community relied on it as a staple food. Rice prices soared. Norton, seeing an opportunity, attempted to corner the market. He invested heavily, buying up shipments of rice with the intention of controlling supply and driving prices even higher. It was a calculated gamble, the kind that could make a man enormously wealthy if it succeeded. It did not succeed. Shortly after Norton made his purchases, several ships arrived from South America carrying large quantities of rice. The market flooded, prices collapsed. Norton's investment became worthless overnight. He tried to void his contracts, arguing that he had been deceived about the shipments. The courts disagreed. Norton lost the case. He lost his fortune. He lost everything. For several years, Norton disappeared from public view. Records from this period are sparse, but it is clear that he was destitute. He likely lived on the streets or in cheap boarding houses, struggling to survive. The loss of his wealth, combined with the humiliation of his failed scheme, seems to have triggered a mental breakdown. When Norton reappeared in 1859, He was no longer the businessman he had once been. He was someone entirely different. On September 17, 1859, Norton walked into the San Francisco Bulletin and declared himself emperor. The proclamation read, "At the peremptory request and desire of a large majority of the citizens of these United States, I, Joshua Norton, formerly of Algoa Bay, Cape of Good Hope, and now for the last 9 years and 10 months past of San Francisco, California, declare and proclaim myself emperor of these United States." He signed it, Norton was. The editor, perhaps amused, perhaps sympathetic, published it. The reaction was not mockery, but fascination. San Francisco, a city built on eccentricity and reinvention, had found its emperor. Norton took his role seriously. He did not treat his emperorship as a joke. He believed, or seemed to believe, that he was the legitimate ruler of the United States. And San Francisco, with remarkable collective generosity, chose to treat him as such. Norton dressed the part. He wore a blue military uniform, likely a second-hand officer's coat, decorated with homemade brass buttons and gold epaulettes. On his head, he wore a beaver skin hat adorned with a peacock feather. He carried a cane and walked with an air of authority. The outfit was absurd, but it was also dignified. Norton did not dress like a beggar. He dressed like an emperor, or at least like his vision of one. He issued proclamations regularly, and newspapers printed them. Some were whimsical. He abolished Congress, declaring it inefficient and corrupt. He ordered the construction of a suspension bridge across San Francisco Bay, a proposal that was laughed at in the 1860s, but became reality with the Bay Bridge in 1936. He issued currency, printing his own bills in denominations ranging from 50 cents to $10. Remarkably, local businesses honored them, accepting Norton's scrip as payment for goods and services. Norton attended civic events as a dignitary. Theater owners reserved seats for him. Restaurants fed him without charge. When his uniform wore out, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to provide him with a new one, paid for by the city. The resolution was respectful, acknowledging his contributions to the city's character and spirit. He was not ignored or humored in a condescending way. He was genuinely welcomed. When Norton attended a session of the California State Legislature, he was seated in a place of honor. When he inspected the city's police force, officers stood at attention. When he issued a decree, it was reported in the papers as though it were official government business. Norton's decrees ranged from the practical to the absurd. He ordered the dissolution of political parties, which he viewed as divisive. He proclaimed religious tolerance, forbidding sectarian conflict. He demanded infrastructure improvements, better treatment of Chinese immigrants, and reforms to the legal system. Some of his ideas were ahead of their time. Others were simply the musings of a man disconnected from political reality. But Norton was not delusional in all respects. He understood that he had no real power. He knew he was not actually the emperor. Yet he maintained the performance, and San Francisco maintained it with him. It was a collective act of kindness, a citywide agreement to treat a broken man with dignity rather than cruelty. Norton's daily routine was well known. He would walk the streets, inspecting buildings, observing construction projects, and greeting citizens. He would stop to chat with shopkeepers, offer advice to city officials, and issue proclamations on matters of public concern. He would attend church services, always sitting in a prominent pew. He would dine at restaurants, never paying, but always thanked for his patronage. He slept in cheap boarding houses, where landlords charged him little or nothing. He had 2 dogs, Bummer and Lazarus, who became famous in their own right. The dogs roamed the city with Norton, and when Lazarus died, newspapers published obituaries. When Bummer died a few years later, Mark Twain wrote a satirical eulogy. The dogs were as much a part of San Francisco's identity as Norton himself. Norton also had critics. Some saw him as a public nuisance. In 1867, a police officer arrested Norton for involuntary commitment to a mental institution. The public outcry was immediate. Newspapers condemned the arrest. Citizens protested. The police chief personally apologized and ordered Norton's release. The officer who made the arrest was reprimanded. From that point on, police officers saluted Norton when they passed him on the street. Norton's currency became collectible. His proclamations were saved and cherished. He was a living legend, a symbol of San Francisco's tolerance, eccentricity, and willingness to embrace the strange and the different. Norton's self-proclaimed emperorship sparked debate, though not about his sanity. Everyone understood he was not truly the emperor. The controversy lay in what his story represented and how society should treat those who exist outside conventional norms. Some critics argued that humoring Norton was cruel, that it enabled a mentally ill man's delusions rather than helping him. They believed he should have been institutionalized, treated, and reintegrated into productive society. But this view was a minority. Most San Franciscans saw their treatment of Norton not as mockery, but as compassion. He was harmless, dignified, and brought joy to the city. Why force him into an institution when he was happier as emperor? Others saw Norton as a critique of political authority. His proclamations, while eccentric, often contained kernels of truth. He condemned political corruption, called out government inefficiency, and advocated for social reforms. In a sense, Norton's absurd claim to power highlighted the absurdity of all political power. If Norton could declare himself emperor and be treated with respect, what did that say about the legitimacy of elected officials? The controversy also extended to the question of mental illness and societal responsibility. Norton was clearly suffering from some form of psychological distress, likely triggered by his financial ruin. In most cities, he would have been ignored, institutionalized, or worse. But San Francisco chose a different path. They allowed him to live with dignity, to maintain his delusion, and to contribute to the community in his own way. Was this kindness or neglect? The answer depends on one's perspective. Some modern commentators have criticized San Francisco's treatment of Norton as exploitation. They argue that the city turned a mentally ill man into a spectacle, a tourist attraction, rather than offering genuine help. But contemporary accounts suggest Norton was not unhappy. He lived a life of purpose, respect, and community. He was fed, clothed, and protected. His funeral drew thousands of mourners, suggesting genuine affection rather than mockery. The controversy also lies in the question of who gets to be treated with kindness. Norton was white, educated, and had once been wealthy. Would a poor immigrant or a person of color have been treated the same way? Probably not. San Francisco's tolerance for Norton was rooted, at least in part, in his background and his ability to perform the role of emperor convincingly. This raises uncomfortable questions about whose eccentricities are celebrated and whose are criminalized. Finally, the controversy is about memory. Norton has been romanticized, turned into a folk hero, a symbol of a gentler, kinder time. But the reality is more complex. He was a man who lost everything and whose mind broke under the strain. San Francisco's treatment of him was kind, but it was also a form of performance, a citywide act of irony and sentimentality. The line between compassion and condescension is not always clear. Norton lived as emperor for 21 years. On January 8, 1880, he collapsed on a street corner while walking to a lecture. He died before medical help could arrive. He was around 60 years old. The news of his death spread quickly. Newspapers printed tributes. The San Francisco Chronicle wrote, "He had shed no blood, robbed no one, and despoiled no country," which is more than can be said of his fellows in that line. It was a fitting epitaph for a man who had claimed absolute power, but wielded none. Norton's funeral was one of the largest San Francisco had ever seen. Over 10,000 people attended, lining the streets to pay their respects. Flags were flown at half-mast. Businesses closed. The funeral procession stretched for miles. He was buried in the Masonic Cemetery, and the city's elite, the same people who had fed and clothed him, paid for the service. In death, Norton was mourned not as a joke, but as a beloved figure, a symbol of the city's character and generosity. His grave became a site of pilgrimage. Visitors left coins, flowers, and notes. In 1934, his remains were moved to Woodlawn Cemetery in Colma, where a more permanent monument was erected. It reads, "Norton Ah, Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico." The immediate consequence of Norton's death was a sense of loss. San Francisco had lost a part of its identity. The city had defined itself, in part, by how it treated Norton. His presence had been a daily reminder that kindness, tolerance, and humor could coexist with urban life. His absence left a void. Culturally, Norton's legacy endured. He became a symbol of San Francisco's eccentricity, a character who embodied the city's willingness to embrace the strange and unconventional. Stories about Norton were passed down through generations. He appeared in literature, most notably in works by Mark Twain, who knew Norton personally and was influenced by him. Psychologically, Norton's story had a lasting impact on how mental illness and homelessness were perceived, at least in San Francisco. Norton proved that a person experiencing psychological distress could still live a life of dignity and purpose if the community chose to support them. This was a radical idea in the 19th century and remains relevant today. Politically, Norton's proclamations, once dismissed as the ravings of a madman, have been reassessed. Some of his ideas, such as the construction of a bridge across the bay, the protection of Chinese immigrants, and the dissolution of partisan politics, were ahead of their time. Norton was not just a harmless eccentric. He was, in his own way, a visionary. The legacy of Emperor Norton is one of compassion, community, and the recognition that dignity is not dependent on wealth, status, or sanity. He has become one of the most beloved figures in San Francisco history, a symbol of what a city can be when it chooses kindness over cruelty. Historically, Norton is remembered as America's only emperor, a title he claimed without force or legitimacy, but which the city of San Francisco granted him through collective agreement. His story is unique in American history, a case where a community chose to indulge and support an individual's delusion, not out of mockery, but out of respect. Culturally, Norton has become a folk hero. He has been referenced in countless books, films, and television shows. He appears in science fiction, alternate history novels, and historical fiction. He is a character in works by Mark Twain, Robert Louis Stevenson, and Neil Gaiman. His image has been used in tourism campaigns, local branding, and civic celebrations. San Francisco has embraced Norton as part of its identity, a reminder of the city's tolerance and eccentricity. The legacy also lies in what Norton's story says about community responsibility. In most cities, Norton would have been ignored, institutionalized, or left to die on the streets. But San Francisco chose a different path. They fed him, clothed him, protected him, and honored him. This was not charity in the traditional sense. It was recognition of shared humanity, a collective decision to treat a vulnerable person with dignity. Psychologically, Norton's story offers a counter-narrative to the usual treatment of mental illness. He was not cured. He was not rehabilitated. He was allowed to live his delusion in peace, and in doing so, he found purpose, community, and respect. This raises important questions about how society should treat those who experience reality differently. Is it always necessary to impose treatment, or can compassion sometimes mean accepting people as they are? Politically, Norton's legacy is subversive. His absurd claim to power highlighted the absurdity of all political authority. His proclamations, while eccentric, often contained legitimate critiques of government corruption, inefficiency, and injustice. Norton was a satirist, whether he intended to be or not, and his satire has outlasted the politicians he mocked. Ethically, Norton's story is a reminder that kindness costs little and means much. The people of San Francisco did not impoverish themselves by feeding Norton. Businesses did not collapse by accepting his currency. The city did not suffer by treating him with respect. Yet the impact of that kindness was profound. Norton lived a life of dignity because a community chose to give it to him. The most enduring legacy of Emperor Norton is the question his story poses. What kind of society do we want to be? One that mocks and discards those who are different? Or one that finds room for eccentricity, compassion, and humanity? San Francisco in the 19th century chose the latter. And in doing so, they created a legend that has endured for over a century. In the end, Emperor Norton was not a ruler. He was a reminder that power is often an illusion, that dignity is a choice, and that a community's character is defined not by how it treats the powerful, but by how it treats the powerless. Norton had no army, no wealth, and no authority, but he had a city that loved him, and that perhaps is the greatest legacy of all.